Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear friends. Hope you had a lovely week. Today we are back with a new topic regarding the Quran, and one of the most sensitive areas regarding Islam and the Prophet of Islam is something that we're going to discuss today, and this relates to the marriages of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in all he had 11 wives, not all at the same time, but at different times. And we will today study, as per the Quran, what exactly was the reason that he had this number of wives. And of course, this is one of the, I would say, objections or questions which a lot of people level against Islam. They would like to know that why is it that in the first place, that the first thing, of course, is not palatable and digestible, and that is that why are Muslims allowed to marry more than one wife? And of course the number goes on to four. But in the case of their Prophet, the issue is even more serious, because people now think that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the Prophet of Islam, was given special permission to marry even more than four wives, and therefore they regard this to be something of a grave matter, a serious matter. But inshallah, today, as we will study this issue in detail and study this issue in its perspective, and also to study it in the light of the Quran, we will come to know that as far as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is concerned, in the prime of his life, when of course people would be doing all sorts of things, Prophet Muhammad was extremely chaste. He was extremely sincere, and he remained sincere to his wives all his life. And his adult life, starting from maybe his 20s right up to in his 50s, he had just one wife. The way, I mean, he got married the way people get married, and as he pulled along in life, there were certain issues that arose in his times, and therefore, as those issues arose, some permissions were given by the Almighty, and at the same time, of course, there were certain things that had to be kept into consideration vis-a-vis these marriages. So I'm going to talk about the marriages of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in detail, and I'll also discuss that he had one slave woman, also one slave lady, one called Maria the Copt, and her matter will also be brought up today. But as I said, this is a very, very important subject for us to understand, not only as Muslims, because we ourselves would like to know that what happened, but also as people who would be living amongst non-Muslims, having teachers, having our class fellows, our classmates, our colleagues who might be non-Muslims, and they would like to know that why at all the Prophet of Islam had so many wives. And this is in stark contrast with actually Christians, and because they think that their own Prophet Jesus, he never married, and this is a historical or established fact that he never married. And so therefore to them, someone having 11 wives, of course not at the same time, but in all he had 11 wives, is another issue that that is but natural to bother their mind. But as I said, if you keep things in perspective, if you view things in their proper background, you will understand, inshallah, that as far as the marriage of the Prophet are concerned, they were all conducted. I mean, the first marriage was conducted just as marriages are conducted in the lives of all of us. It's but natural to marry, and so you will see that once his marriage was conducted, the first wife that he married, of course, was Khadija radhiyallahu anha, and Khadija herself actually proposed to Prophet Muhammad. And according to the popular narrative, the Prophet was 25 years old, and Khadija radhiyallahu anha was 40 years old, and the Prophet would be looking after her trade caravans and her trade merchandise, and she, of course, was very impressed by the Prophet, the way he handled things. And we all know that even before he was called to prophethood, he was given this title of Sadiq and Amin. Sadiq means the truthful, and Amin means the trustworthy. So the truthful and the trustworthy, these were the two titles which the Prophet had before marriage. And Khadija radhiyallahu anha, of course, was truly impressed by his ability. And of course, you would see that even in his own times, there were people who were his enemies, the people who were against him, but they still trusted him, and they would actually confine their trusts to things that they have in possession of Prophet Muhammad, and of course they would regard him to be truthful. So do remember that there is no better a praise than earned by one's enemy. So the enemies of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they used to call him Sadiq and Amin. They used to say that everything can happen, but he cannot tell a lie. He's always a truthful person. He's always a trustworthy person. So obviously, these qualities of the Prophet stood out, must have stood out in those times, and this led to his marriage with Khadija Rizala Anha. She was a divorcee. She was divorced, and so the Prophet married a divorcee. Do remember this, that this is how things got along, and for 25 years the two of them remained married. So a better part of his life, which would account for his adult life, his middle ages, he never married the way we think that he must have gone on a spree of marriages, as is generally portrayed or as is generally understood when we just glance at the number of his wives. So this never happened. So when Khadija radiallahu anha died, Prophet had very young children. So he had two daughters and four sons, or some say three sons. So all of them by Khadija radiallahu anha, and of course Fatima radiallahu anha was also from a daughter of Khadija, and she was the only one who survived other children. The rest of the children, they died, some of them in infancy and some of them later on. But the prominent person who survived, or the prominent offspring of the Prophet who survived, was Khadija radiallahu anha, and she, as you would know, later on married Ali radiallahu anhu, and Ali became the son-in-law of the Prophet. So as Khadija died and the Prophet was in his 50s, so what happened was that there was this lady who was of course someone who would get people married, as we have today. We have a lot of websites in which we have that matchmaking and etc., in which we get we are able to find a proposal for one another, find a spouse through those websites. So of course in the times of the Prophet, no such websites existed. There was no internet and there was no nothing like that. So there were women who would come to various houses, and they would actually propose and do this matchmaking. So one of these women's khala, she actually went up to the Prophet once, and she said, well, you're now a person who is well in his 50s, and you have young children, and you need someone who would look after your children and of course provide companionship to you. And so you see the history as it goes, you find that the Prophet never started looking for a wife when Khadija died. It was in fact the other way around. This lady Khala, she came up to the Prophet and said that you have young children, and why don't you marry another time, and you'll have a companion for your own self, and at the same time the children will feel very comfortable because they are so young that for you to discharge your responsibilities as a Prophet of God and at the same time look after these children would of course become very, very difficult. And you know what the Prophet said? Well, I mean, he was very reflective, very contemplating in his mood, and he said, okay, do you know that there is someone who I can marry? It's just like a question that he asked. And that lady said, yes, I know two ladies who might be suitable for you. So one of them is a virgin, she's an unmarried lady, and the other one is another lady who is older in life, and she's almost close to the Prophet's age. And the Prophet said, okay, if you think that this is something that is going to help me, maybe you can ask these ladies or one of them if a match can be made. So now started the process in which the Prophet, after losing his first wife and then being approached by a woman to marry, that he actually thought of this as a person that he should marry, and he actually gave permission to Khala that if she has someone in her mind, then she can go there. So what happened was that this lady first went to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who was of course a very close companion of the Prophet, and being a close companion of the Prophet, he asked him that if her daughter, who was of course Aisha radiallahu anha, if he would be willing to marry her with the Prophet. And Abu Bakr replied, well, I have already committed Aisha to another place, and I've already had her hand arranged with someone else. And although this is an engagement, but we have yet to finally decide. So it was like a no from him. I mean, like a semi-no. And so that lady Khala, what happened was that she then went to the older lady. Her name was Sada, and as I said, Sada was someone that who was older in age, close to the Prophet's age. And Sada, when she said that, when she heard that the Prophet had actually asked for someone's hand and she could be one of them, she was very happy for that, and she immediately agreed. And now what happened was that as Sada had agreed, and that lady was, of course, telling the Prophet Muhammad that you have a match for you, suddenly Abu Bakr approached Khala and said that, well, I have asked my daughter, I mean, I've asked the person who was engaged to my daughter, and it seems that they are no longer interested. So my daughter is also available. Now, this was sort of a happening which that lady never imagined, that she would get the consent of both women. Remember, she just wanted to ask for one woman, and she went to them one by one. So when Aisha radiallahu anha, she got to know that she had already been engaged, she went to Sada. Sada accepted, and at the same time Abu Bakr also said that, well, my daughter is also available. Now this was something very sensitive, because Abu Bakr, of course, was a very close companion, and Sada, of course, had already consented, and it was virtually difficult for the Prophet to say no to both of them at the same time, because both had consented. But remember, Khala, who had gone for that proposal, only intended one of them. So she actually was perplexed, and she said, well, both of them are now available, and because I had asked both of them, and now, of course, it's a very sensitive topic to turn either one of them down. So the Prophet was now in a fix that what has to be done, what can be done. And ultimately, the only solution that came up to his mind, of course, was that, well, because both of them have consented and it would be rude to reject either one of them. So he accepted the proposals of both these women. And remember, I'll explain this later on when we finish this whole journey through his Prophet's marriages, that Aisha radiallahu anha, at the time of her engagement, actually the nikah was conducted, not engagement, she was 17 years old. And as is the popular narrative that she was maybe a 7-year-old girl or an 8-year-old girl, this is not true entirely. This is absolutely wrong. It has been wrongly understood. Aisha radiallahu anha, at the time of her nikah, the nikah was conducted in Mecca, but the departure or the rukhsati never took place until the Prophet went to Medina. So you can see that the Prophet, after Khadija's death, when he was in his 50s, he married both Sada and Aisha, but he took Sada home, but Aisha he deferred for a couple of years, and he said that, okay, her marriage will, or her consummation will take place after some time, although the nikah had been conducted, but she never came to the Prophet's house until after 3 years. So this was in Medina. When the Prophet migrated to Medina, he had only one wife, who was Sada radiallahu anha, and then after 2 years in Medina, we know that Aisha radiallahu anha, she was brought home by the Prophet, and now the Prophet had two wives, Sada and Aisha. And as I said earlier on, that Aisha, at the time of her departure to the Prophet's house, was 19 years old. And I will just dispel this misconception that she was 7 years old in a while. So now what happened was, you can clearly see that at this time the Prophet has two wives. One of them is Sada, the other one is Aisha. And when in Medina, you know what happened in Medina, as all of you have studied Islamic history, or most of you must have this knowledge, that in Medina there were these battles that took place. So the first battle, the first prominent battle which took place between the Prophet and his enemies was the Battle of Badr. And then there was the Battle of Uhud right after that, in a very short space. Now what happened in these two battles was that a lot of women, they became widows. A lot of Muslim women, they became widows because their husbands, they were martyred in these battles. And a lot of their children became orphans as a result. And this is something which was rampant, which took its toll, and the Islamic society, or the Muslim society in Medina, you can clearly see, was suffering from this malaise, that there were a lot of there were a lot of widows, and there were a lot of orphans. So Now, what happened was that, keeping in view the Arab custom of those times in which people used to marry more than one wives, this is something very common in Arabia. Now, remember, we have shifted to Medina. The Prophet has come over to Medina. He has two wives. One of them is Sada, and the other one is Aisha. The first of them was Khadija, who had died in Mecca, and the Prophet therefore had embarked upon, at the suggestion of some lady, he had consented to marry someone, and accidentally the consent of both these women took place, and therefore he married both of them. Sada he brought home immediately after marriage, but Aisha he deferred, and her nikah, or her marriage, was consummated 2 years after migration, and then she also became part of the Prophet's household. Okay, so now we reach the time in Medina when, as I just said, that battles had taken place, and these battles, as I said, resulted in the death of, or the martyrdom of, a number of Muslims. So the Quran, using this custom of multiple marriages, which pre-existed the Quran. I mean, Arabs used to marry more than one wife. They had 7, 8, 11, and many wives, multiple wives in their own times. And so what the Quran said, the Quran asked, and in fact it appealed to the Muslim society, and it said, well, you marry people for various reasons. You marry it for your own comfort. You can marry for your own any reason that comes to you. It is all okay. But now that women have become widows because of these battles, the Quran appealed to all Muslims that if they could marry so that they are able to take care of these orphans, and the best way to take care of these orphans would be to marry their mothers, because there could no better be a combination than marrying the mother of an orphan, because it would become very easy to look after the orphans. So primarily it was for the benefit of the orphans that the Quran appealed to Muslims that they should marry more than one wife, but at the same time it imposed two restrictions. So it said that you cannot marry more than 4 wives, and at the same time you must be just to all your wives. And if these two conditions are not met, then even for a cause as noble as supporting the orphans, they should not marry more than one wife. But if they can, then these are the widows which are present in the society, and they need help, they need a home, and more than that, their children need a home, their children need a father. So if you are able to support them, this would be wonderful. So we now pick up this narrative from the Quran from here onwards and see how the remaining marriages materialized. So remember, up till now we have the Prophet having 2 wives. In fact, he had 3 up till that time. One of them had already died, Khadija. He had Aisha and Sada in his home. So at this juncture, you can now see, I was just narrating to you the fact that these battles took place in the times of Prophet Muhammad, and as I said, children became orphans and women became widows. So this is the verse which I was just talking about, and let me read out this verse and then I'll explain a little more. So it says that وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَلَّا تَعُولُوا وآتوا النساء صدقاتهن نحلة فإن طبن لكم عن شيء منه نفسا فكلوه هنيئا مريئا. So it says, and if you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry their mothers who are lawful to you, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or those which your right hands possess. That will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. And give these women their dowers also the way dowers are given. But if they of their own good pleasure remit any part of it to you, take it and consume it gladly. So this was the first instance, as you can see, in which you get this appeal from the Quran that Muslim men have been asked to marry, and for this marriage, for these marriages, you see, the Quran says that dowers must be given, because dower is something which is the right of a woman. Remember, we've, I think, discussed someplace else that dower is basically given as a token of the fact that a Muslim man or a Muslim husband says that he is now willing to take the financial responsibility of the woman that he is bringing home. So dower is something which is the token of that expression, that you give a woman a dower when you intend to marry her, in order to assure her that now, from now on, I will be taking care of you financially. So the Quran says that even for this purpose, when you are marrying orphans' mothers, you must give them dowers. At the same time, you must deal with them justly, and the marriages must not exceed 4. So these were the restrictions which were imposed by the Quran. And you know what? At the appeal of the Quran, now what happened was that Muslims started to marry to accommodate these widows and these orphans also. Now, being the leader of the Muslims, Prophet Muhammad also sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he also felt his obligation that if the Quran has asked him to accommodate widows in marriage, then he should also set an example for the rest of the Muslim community. So he married 2 women. One of them was Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and the other was Hafsa radhiyallahu anha. So both of them were widows, and their husbands had died in these battles. And Hafsa radhiyallahu anha, incidentally, was also the daughter of Hazrat Umar radhiyallahu anhu. So you can see that the Prophet had Aisha amongst his wives, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, and he had Hafsa, who was the daughter of Umar. So in these battles, 2 more wives were added, and the primary result of this was not any, God forbid, lust or any desire that he might be having. It was just to accommodate these women in his household, and of course the children who had become orphans. So now he had 4 wives. So he had Aisha and Sada, who were obviously the ones who were already there. Then, because of this appeal which was made by the Quran to marry widows, he married 2, and one was Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and the 4th one was Hafsa bint Umar. So now he had 4 wives. Okay, now what happened was that after some time, Zainab bint Khuzaimah, she died. Now, as a result, the Prophet was left with 3 wives, and he could still accommodate 1 more wife for the same cause, which we just discussed, so that he could help these widows and orphans. So now he married another lady. Her name was Salama, and Salama was someone who had lost her husband in one of these battles, and so therefore now once again the Prophet had 4 wives. So these 4 were living. Remember, the first of them was Khadija, who had died already, and Zainab bint Khuzaimah, who had died after her marriage. So in all, the Prophet now had 4 wives. I mean, if you take the total, there were 6 in all up till now. 2 of them had died, and 4 of them remained. And of course, he could not have married more than 4 wives, because the Quran said that even if you are able to do justice to your wives, then in that case also you just cannot go beyond 4. So you can clearly see that until this time, what had happened was that for natural causes, the Prophet just married Khadija, and at her death he was left with young children. So therefore he at the proposal of a lady, he was willing to marry again, and although he never took the initiative was from someone else, and that lady actually accidentally got the approval of 2 women, both Sada and Aisha, of course Aisha through her father. And so it was not appropriate to refuse them. So both of them were brought home. Sada was brought first. Aisha was already, although the nikah took place in Mecca, but the rukhsati or the departure of the bride to the Prophet's house took place in Medina. So at this juncture, he had 2 wives. In fact, 3, one of them had died, and 2 of them were Aisha and Sada. And then these battles took place, as I just described the Quranic verse before you. And these battles, you can clearly see, were ones in which the Quran actually appealed to the Muslims that they must accommodate women for this cause, especially to accommodate the orphans. So the Prophet married 2 amongst them. This would have made the total 4, and Muslims, of course, were not allowed to marry more than 4. He married Zainab bint Khuzaimah and Hafsa bint Umar. So Zainab, after some months, she died. So now the Prophet now had 3 wives, and now he had the chance to accommodate 1 more lady, and so now he married Salama, whose husband Abu Salama had been martyred in the Battle of Uhud. So now the Prophet had 4 wives, and the battle of Uhud had taken place, and you can clearly see we are now reaching the first quarter of the Medinan period. Uh, the natural wives, of course, were the ones out which the Prophet undertook marriage in those natural circumstances, just to look after the children, and then these two, they were specially meant, or they were specially married just to accommodate them, and of course their children. Okay, if it is now clear, I mean, if the narrative is now now evident to you that how these marriages have proceeded, we now go on to the next marriage of the Prophet, and of course now this is something which is also deeply rooted in the Arab society. And as we go along, I will then let you know that what happened here is something which was actually cited by the Qur'an, and the Almighty Himself then extended the circle of marriages of the Prophet to beyond 4. So all Muslims, they were required to stay within the limits. They could only marry 4 women. But for the Prophet, after his 4th marriage, a 5th marriage was being conducted, and at the time of that marriage, the Almighty Himself said that now a special permission is being given to the Prophet for a certain reason, and now I'm going to describe that reason to you and also read out the concerning Quranic verse. So what happened in the Arab society of those times is that women were kept as slaves, and men were also kept as slaves. And the one of the foremost directives of the Quran was that it wanted to emancipate slavery. It wanted to emancipate Muslim women, maid servants, or you can say maids, and people who had become slaves as a result of battles and as a result of being bought from various slave markets. So Islam embarked upon a gradual process of the eradication of slavery, and it undertook various measures. It asked them to release necks of people. It asked them that they should give them the same status as they themselves have in their lives, so that it would become difficult for them to maintain a slave, and they would have to liberate a slave, and a number of other directives which at the moment I'm not going to discuss, because that's another topic that we'll be discussing inshallah sometime later. And ultimately what happened was that slavery was theoretically totally banished from Arabia when in his last year, or close to his last years, the Prophet was given this revelation that all slaves must be set free if they want to. And very earlier on, near the Battle of Badr, it had already been said that no new slaves would be made, and in all the battles, slaves, the prisoners of war who would be generally regarded as slaves, would be released at all cost. So the Quran adopted one more measure, which we are just now going to discuss, which resulted in the Prophet's 5th marriage, and that was that it wanted to elevate the status of slaves in the you can say the Arab society. So the Prophet's own son, Zayd ibn Harisa, his name was, he was an adopted son, of course, not his real son. So Prophet's adopted son, and Zayd ibn Harisa was himself a slave, and the Prophet had liberated him. So in order to elevate the status of slaves, the Prophet asked one of his paternal cousins, Zainab bint Jahash. Now remember, the other lady who had died was Zainab bint Khuzaima. So there's another one by the same name, and her name is Zainab bint Jahash. The Prophet asked Zainab bint Jahash that if she could marry Zayd ibn Harisa, then this would be a wonderful change in the Arab society, because this would elevate the status of slaves. Because when when a former slave marries a woman who is free, I mean, he's not a slave, then this actually elevates the status, and this is what the Prophet had in mind. That if Zayd ibn Harisa, who was his adopted son, who was originally a slave but he had been liberated by the Prophet, if he gets married to Zainab bint Jahash, then this would actually be something which would be very good for the institution of slavery in eradicating it, and this would also bring people to this conclusion that they are equal in status to free men and women. But unfortunately, this marriage could not be pulled along. And Zayd ibn Harisa, because of the fact that he was a former slave, And Zainab bint Jahash, she was slightly, you can say, a lady who had this sense of her own status. Somehow this could not match, and it became a mismatch. And Zayd ibn Harisa actually told the Prophet that it's difficult for him to be a husband of a lady because he feels that she is superior to him in status, and at times Zainab would also perhaps inadvertently even express that superiority, and this would really be very, I mean, it would really weigh heavily down on the sensitive disposition which Zaid had. So Zaid actually asked the Prophet that I'm going to divorce her because it's very difficult for me to keep her as my wife, and I just cannot do that. And the Prophet was very concerned, and he knew that if this happened, then it would be all hell broken loose, because this would mean that he would have to pacify Zainab by marrying her himself, because this was the only way to pacify her, because it was on her request that, on his request that Zainab had married Zayd ibn Harisa. So he continued to advise Zaid that you must not do it, and please keep her in wedlock. So now we pick up this narrative once again from the Quran, because this is the fifth marriage which now the Quran discusses, and this has been mentioned in the Quran. And okay, let's read out this verse. So this is the verse which is actually which discusses the marriages, the fifth marriage of the Prophet. It says, وَإِذْ تَقُولُ لِلَّذِي أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَأَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِ أَمْسِكْ عَلَيْكَ زَوْجَكَ وَاتَّقِ اللَّهَ وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ وَتَخْشَى النَّاسَ وَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ أَنْ تَخْشَاهُ فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِنْهَا وَطَرًا زَوَّجْنَاكَهَا لِكَيْ لَا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ حَرَجٌ فِي أَزْوَاجِ أَدْعِيَائِهِمْ إِذَا قَضَوْا مِنْهُنَّ وَطَرًا وَكَانَ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ مَفْعُولًا. And remember, O Prophet, when you were repeatedly saying to one who had received the favor of God in your favor, of course referring to Zaid, retain your wife in wedlock. The Prophet would be asking him not to divorce his wife, and fear God, and you were hiding in your heart that which God was about to make manifest. You were fearing the people, but it is more fitting that you fear God. Then when Zaid broke his relationship with her, now look what the Almighty Himself is saying, that when Zaid broke his relationship with, of course, with Zainab bint Jahash, and by the way, Zaid is the only person, is the only companion of the Prophet who has been mentioned in the Quran ever. The whole of the Quran never mentions any companion. The only companion that the Quran mentions is Zaid. So the word Zaid, as you can see, occurs in the text and referring to Zaid ibn Harisa, and also referring to the fact how important this marriage became. So then when Zaid broke his relationship with her, which means that he divorced her, we means God said, we joined her in marriage to you means to you, O Prophet, so that in future there may be no difficulty on the believers in the matter of marriage with the wives of their adopted sons, when the latter have dissolved their relationship of marriage with them, and this command of God had to be fulfilled. Okay, now steps in another important aspect, which actually the Almighty had in mind. So remember, the Prophet's purpose of having the two married was to elevate the status of a slave who was a former slave, of course, Zaid, and he wanted this slavery to, this emancipation of slavery to take place. And at the same time, the Almighty had another purpose in this, and He said that if this is the case, that you have to divorce your wife, this is something that that has to be done, then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam must marry Zainab for another reason. One reason was which the Prophet had in mind, and what was that? Because he felt that he was responsible for the failure of this marriage, and therefore if there was any way to console Zainab bint Jahash, it would only have been that if he marry her. So this was the reason that the Prophet had in mind, and he did not want to express this, because if he would have expressed the fact that the only reason to console or the only way to console Zainab would be to marry her, people would have created a huge propaganda against him for that, and they would have said, look, he is marrying the wife of his adopted son. And this the Prophet said he never liked, and of course this is obviously understood. But the Almighty had another purpose to for this marriage to take place. And that was that there was this Arab custom in those times in which the adopted wife, the adopted son could not, or you can say the adopted son had a status which was like a real son. So therefore, the wife of an adopted son could not be married. This was an age-old custom, and this had to be set right. And only a prophet could have done this. So the Almighty in fact ordered Prophet Muhammad that you have to marry Zainab, because this would be the way to actually rectify that custom. And the custom was that a person who had a wife and the person himself was an adopted child, of course not a real child, then as I said, the custom was that the person could not marry the wife of his adopted child. In order to set right this custom forever, the Almighty said, now that he has divorced your wife, Zainab, you have to marry her not only for the reason that you have in your mind, which was to console her, but also for the fact that this is the only way to eradicate this custom in which an adopted son and a real son would be regarded as equal, because we know that you cannot marry the wife of your real son. And the Arabs have given the adopted son the same status. So this had to be set right. Even today, of course, in the Sharia, you cannot marry the wife of your son. But as far as the adopted son is concerned, this is something which is allowed, and this had to be changed. So this is how the fifth marriage of the Prophet was conducted. And as I said, that this is something which the Almighty Himself actually said, that we zawwajnakaha, that because of the fact that the Almighty intended to set right this custom, He actually asked the Prophet to marry a fifth time. And at the same time, He said that now the rules for you have been changed. Although the Muslims have to marry 4 wives, I mean they can marry up to 4 wives, but for the Prophet this restriction has been eliminated, so that as a Prophet of God and as a messenger of God, some of the duties that he has been assigned, they can be fulfilled in a befitting way. So the fifth marriage of the Prophet, as I said, was conducted by Zainab, by the Prophet with Zainab bint Jahash, because of the fact that the Almighty wanted to amend or rectify this age-old tradition in which the wife of an adopted son could not be married. But this was, of course, allowed as a result of this. And so the Prophet married Zainab bint Jahash, and she became his fifth wife. Okay, so I hope you are following the sequence. I have to give you these details so that you are able to understand that how the whole narrative has proceeded and how these marriages of the Prophet were conducted as a result of the mission that he had been imposed. Remember, just to recap, the first marriage was with Khadija. Khadija died, and the Prophet was left with no spouse. And then there was a lady who came up to him and said, "Well, I have 2 proposals for you, and you should get married." The Prophet, although never took the initiative, but he actually consented. And then accidentally he received the consent of 2 women. One of them was Sada, and the other was Aisha, and both came to his household. One of them earlier, and the other one later on. So up till that time, he had 3 wives. One of them had died, Khadija, and the 2 of them was with him. And as I said, this also is an important thing, that Aisha was not 7 years old or 6 years old, as is generally contended. She was a 19-year-old lady when she came to the house of the Prophet. So up till that time, he had 2 wives. And then remember, we said that those battles took place in which a number of children became orphans and a number of women became widows. So in order to cater for them, the Qur'an appealed to all Muslims that they should accommodate widows. And at this appeal, the Prophet himself took lead, and he married 2 widows. One of them was Zainab bint Khuzaimah, and the other was Hafsa bint Umar. So after a while, Zainab bint Khuzaimah died, and the Prophet had now 3 wives. So he could marry another one, and he could accommodate another widow, and then he married Salama. So up till that, he had 4 wives. And of course, in total there were 6, but 2 of them had already died. One of them was Khadija, and the other was Zainab bint Khuzaimah. And then I just described to you the next step, the next part of the narrative, which has been actually described by the Quran, that in order to eradicate this custom in which a person could not marry the wife of an adopted son, the Prophet was married off by the Almighty Himself to Zayd ibn Harsa. But remember, Zayd ibn Harsa was married first by the Prophet to Zainab bint Jahash, and his idea of getting them married was to elevate the status of slave women, of slave boys, and because Zayd ibn Harisa was a former slave. But unfortunately, this marriage could not be pulled along. The Prophet tried his best that Zayd ibn Harisa not divorce him, his wife, but it could not happen, and the marriage ended in a failure. And when he divorced her, the Prophet was asked by the Almighty to marry her. One of the reasons, of course, was for the Prophet himself to contend when he actually thought that he would have to console someone, because she had married Zayd at his consent, and the other, which was the primary reason for the Almighty to ask Prophet to marry Zainab, was to eradicate this custom in which the wife of an adopted son had been forbidden. So now we can see that the Prophet had 5 wives. I hope this stepwise introduction to all these wives is now clear. Now we are entering the final stages in which another important directive was once again given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and now we are going to discuss that. And this is again described by the Qur'an in this third passage that we are now going to discuss. And because this passage is slightly longer one, I'm going to skip the Arabic part and I'm just going to read the translation. So remember, we are now entering the final phase in which the rest of the wives that the Prophet was actually married, they are now explained in this passage. So it says, O Prophet, we have made lawful to you the wives whom you have paid their dowers, and free women whom God gives in your possession because of a military campaign, and the daughters of your paternal uncles and aunts, and the daughters of your maternal uncles and aunts who migrated from Mecca with you, and any believing woman who gifts her soul to the Prophet on the condition that the Prophet wishes to marry her. So this first part actually gives the Prophet a whole sphere in which he can marry women in order to discharge his responsibilities as a Prophet of God. And you can see that there are 3 categories that have been actually spelled out. So first of them, the first one is that women who come into his possession through a military campaign. Of course, this would mean that there are women who are of the stature of maybe the heads of their tribes, or maybe the daughters of their tribes, because of the fact that they have a special status and they have no place to go, and out of their own will, if they wish to marry the Prophet, then the Prophet has been asked, or he's been given this permission to marry her. So the first ambit would be, the first sphere would be that women who have been caught in battles, and of course they have to be liberated at all cost, and we've already discussed that they could not have been kept as slaves. They had to be liberated, but because of their special status that they have been liberated, and they also did not wish to go back to their own families, then the Prophet was given this permission that he could marry them. So as a result of this, we can see that the Prophet married 2 women, and both of these women came into his custody as a result of 2 battles. So one of them was the Battle of Bani Mustalaq, and the other one was the Battle of Khaybar. Both of them took place in the middle part of the Medinan period. So in the Battle of the Bani Mustalaq, the Prophet, there was a lady called Javeria, who was the daughter of a tribe. She was the daughter of the head of a tribe, and she was actually caught in a battle, and she was liberated. The Prophet set her free, and at her consent and the Prophet's consent, the 2 got married. And then there was Safiya radhiyallahu anha. She was also one of the prisoners of war which were made in the Battle of Khaybar. And the Prophet, as I said, immediately set them free, because the directive was that you cannot keep prisoners of war as slaves. So the Prophet immediately set them free, and it happened that Safiya consented to marry the Prophet because of the fact that she also was the daughter of a leader of her tribe, and the Prophet, of course, being the leader of the Muslims, it was but befitting that he keep them as women who belong to a certain household, and because of the fact that they were daughters of tribal chiefs. So the Prophet said that it would be befitting for him to marry them. And of course, these marriages never took place out of any coercion or any compelling circumstances. It was at the consent of both these women that they took place. This was the first category, and this is how these 2 marriages materialized. So now the Prophet has how many wives? 7. 5 of them we just discussed. Remember? So he had Aisha, he had Sada, he had Salama, he had Hafsa. Four. And then he married Zainab bint Jahash as a result of that issue of emancipating slaves. Two of them had died, Zainab bint Khuzaima and Khadija bint Khuwailid. And now, in these campaigns, two women who were the leaders of two tribes, they were set free by the Prophet, and out of their consent, they wanted to remain with the Prophet, and the Prophet accepted them as his wives. So they became his wives. So now, after those five wives, these two were added. So the sixth and seventh ones were Javeria and the other one was Safiya. Okay, now look what the verse says. It says that besides this category, there is another category in which the Prophet can marry, and that is the daughters of your maternal uncles and aunts who migrated from Mecca with you. This is the second category. So, daughters of his maternal uncles and aunts who actually, they were both maternal and paternal. And because of the fact that they migrated with the Prophet, and this migration was a cause of severe distress to Muslims, it was not easy to live in a new society. It was not easy to migrate from one society to another society. But they, for this Islamic mission, they dedicated themselves for this cause. And as a result of this, the Prophet married his eighth wife, and that was Habiba. So she was Abu Sufyan's sister. I mean, she was the daughter of, she belonged to his maternal side, and she was someone who had borne a lot of difficulty because of this migration. And then, as a result of the fact that the Prophet could console her for all the bother that he had gone through, because he was allowed to marry amongst the daughters of her maternal and paternal uncles and aunts, so he married Habiba for this. Okay. And now there is a third category also which this verse mentions, and that is and any believing woman who gifts her soul to the Prophet on the condition that the Prophet wishes to marry her. So, as a result of this, this third category is that if some woman wants to dedicate herself to the Prophet, and she just wants her to be associated with the Prophet, and the Prophet also is able to marry her, as he consents to marry her, then this is another category. This is a third category which the Prophet was allowed to marry in. And now, as a result of this, his final marriage took place, which was 11th marriage with Maimuna radhiyallahu anha. So Maimuna, she was an elderly lady, and she just wanted to be associated with the Prophet. And again, the reason was that she was someone who had dedicated herself to the Prophet, and before that to the cause of Islam. So you can see that these three categories, as a result of these three categories, 4 more wives were added to the Prophet's household. So one of them was Safiya, the other was Javeria. They belonged to the first category because they were the ones who were caught in a military campaign, and they were set free, and they, out of their own consent, married the Prophet. And then there was Habiba, who was one of the Prophet's maternal cousins. And then we had the other Maimuna, who had gifted herself to the Prophet. So this completes this count, and I'll just sum it up also before you, that the Prophet in this way, he had married 11 times, but amongst those 11 marriages, 2 of them had died in his own lifetime. One was Khadija and the other one was Zainab bint Khuzaima. But before we sign off, I'm just going to finish reading this verse because there are some other things which are mentioned in this verse which are worthy of note. And they are, look what this says. It's the fifth or sixth line from the top. It says, this directive is specifically for you alone and not for the believers. This is what the Almighty is telling the Prophet Muhammad, that this extension to him to marry more than one wife, beyond 4 wives, is something which is just for you. The Arabic words are khalisatan laka min dunil mu'mineen. It is only for you, O Prophet, because of your status as a messenger and a prophet of God. Okay, we very well know what we have imposed on them as obligations regarding their wives and slave girls, a special directive for you, so that there be no difficulty for you in discharging your duties and in case of any blemish. Allah is forgiving and merciful. You have the authority to keep any of them away from you and keep any of them near you, and it is lawful for you to bring any of them near you whom you have kept away. There is no blame on you in this regard. This explanation is more proper so that they may be contented and not be sorrowful and feel satisfied and with whatever you give all of them. And Allah knows what is in your hearts, and Allah is all knowing and most forbearing. All other women besides these are not lawful for you, and you cannot change them for other wives, even though their beauty attracts you. Slave girls, however, are still allowed to you, and in reality, Allah does watch over all things. So if you read the rest of the passage, it tells you that the Prophet has also been, this restriction of being just to his wives has been restricted, has been lifted from him, because this is something that he is not marrying for some other cause. It's purely for the fact that the Almighty has asked him to accommodate women of these categories, that he is being asked to marry more than 4 wives. And because as a result it would have become impossible for Prophet to do justice, this restriction of doing justice with his wives has been lifted. But history tells us that in spite of the fact this restriction has been lifted, there is not a slight instance reported in which this justice was still not meted out by the Prophet himself. And there is another thing which this restriction, as a result of this restriction, has taken place, and that is that the Prophet cannot divorce any of these wives. I mean, these are the wives that once they have entered into his household as their wives, they can never be divorced. Why? Because now these wives occupy the status of the mothers of the believers. So all of them have been given the status of the mothers of the believers, and as a result they cannot be divorced, and as a result they could not have married anyone else after the Prophet's the Prophet was not even allowed to divorce them. So some restrictions and some relaxations were given as a result, you can see. So now a question remains, which if you would ask me, I will answer in our Q&A session, that of course that this question of him marrying Aisha, is it true that he married her at a young age as is alleged? And what about one of her slave women, Maria the Copt, that was gifted to her by the king of Egypt, which is Macaucus? But before we sign off and you have questions to ask, let me just revise this by presenting before you this summary of the wives of the Prophet. So you can see these 11 wives, the names of these 11 wives being displayed before you. You can see that Khadija was the first person, for the first lady that he married. This took place for a good 25 years. The Prophet never married in his adult life, his adulthood, when he was adolescent, when he was young, other than Khadija. And at her death, he was left with young children. And Aisha and Sada, they came into his marriage, as I just explained. One of them was to be married, but because of the fact that both had consented at the same time and a refusal could not have been made, so therefore Aisha and Sada both got married to him. Sada was brought home immediately, but Aisha's marriage was deferred. I mean, her nikah took place, but her departure was deferred. And then those battles took place. And those battles, the Prophet married Zainab bint Khuzaimah and Hafsa radiyallahu anha. So Zainab died, and so the Prophet now had a chance to marry one more and accommodate one more widowed lady, and he married Salama. So up till that point, he has 6 wives. 2 of them had died, and 4 of them were living. So Khadija and Zainab bint Khuzaimah had died, but Aisha, Sada, Hafsa, and Salama, they were living. And then that famous incident took place in which the Almighty actually asked the Prophet that he should marry another woman, and that was Zainab bint Jahash. And the reason was that the Almighty wanted to eliminate this custom of a person marrying the daughter, or the wife of his adopted son. So Zayd ibn Harisa was the adopted son of the Prophet. The Prophet had Zainab marry her. The marriage could not be pulled along. It was a failure. It had to be ended. And as a result of this termination, the Prophet thought that the only way to console Zainab would be that he marry Zainab, and this would cause a lot of propaganda that he is marrying the wife of his adopted son. But the Almighty said that in fact this has to be done, because this is going to set right an evil tradition amongst the Arabs, in which the wife of an adopted son could not be married, and the adopted son and the real son were treated as the same. So this is how the Almighty himself said, as we just studied, that he said that I am now extending the sphere of 4 marriages beyond 4, and you can marry beyond 4, and one of the fifth marriage that he conducted with was Zainab bint Jahash. And then there was a category, there were three categories which I just mentioned, and amongst these three categories, one was that women who belonged to high society, who belonged to the tribal elders or tribal leaders, and if they were to be set free in a military campaign, then what have to be done with them if they also did not want to go back to their own tribe. And amongst them was Zainab bint Jahash, amongst them was Habiba, Javeria and Safiya, first of them. So Javeria was actually made a prisoner in the battle of Bani Mustalak, but of course the prisoner she could not have remained a prisoner. She was just caught, and she had to be set free. So she was set free, and Safiya was also set free. And Safiya was actually someone who came into the Muslim army as a result of the battle of Khaybar. So both of them were set free, and both of them, out of their own consent, married the Prophet. And then we had the Qur'an telling the Prophet that he could also marry his paternal cousins or maternal cousins who had migrated with him. And as a result, he married Habiba. And this is something, Habiba was, of course, the sister of Abu Sufyan. And so this marriage also took place at the consent of Habiba. And finally, the third category which the Quran has spelled out was the category in which if a woman wanted to gift herself to the Prophet, which meant that she would like herself to be associated with the Prophet, then if the Prophet also consented, then this marriage could have taken place. And this is how Maimuna came into the Prophet's household. So in all, he had these 11 wives, out of which 2 had died in his own lifetime. One was Khadija and the other one was Zainab bint Khuzaima. And now, of course, this is how the narrative has to be explained, that all these wives, like you can clearly see, all these marriages took place because of certain reasons, because of the fact that as the messenger and prophet, or the final messenger or the final prophet of God, there were certain duties which were assigned to him. So he was trying to support women who had become widows. He was asked by the Prophet to actually marry a certain woman, and she was Zainab bint Jahash, because the Almighty wanted to eliminate a custom which I just described. And then we had those last 4 marriages which were conducted as a result of the Quran telling the Prophet that he could marry in those 3 categories, because this was something again which could be the requisite of his mission as a prophet and as a messenger of God. So you can clearly see, my dear friends, that these, except for the first marriage which was conducted naturally, the way we marry, all the rest of these marriages were conducted at the behest of circumstances which arose, or at the behest of some Quranic directives which were given to the Prophet. And the Prophet himself was an addressee of these directives. It was not that he took any initiative, it were the circumstances which were created, and as a result of which he was actually called upon to do so. So I'm sorry I have taken a lot of time to explain this, but as I said, this is an area which needs a little more depth of discussion, because as you see that being Muslims, this is a question that all of us do have in our minds, and of course living amongst non-Muslims, this is a question that you would be asked often by your non-Muslim friends, and you should be in a position to at least explain how this narrative goes along. So thank you very much. I still have the responsibility of explaining a couple of more things, but let me first come back to you and see if you have any other questions that we can answer, or any explanation that you might be needing vis-a-vis the marriages that I have just discussed, especially in the wake of these 3 Quranic passages.
Dr. Shehzad, you explain everything so beautifully and so systematically that we find that people are very clear. We do see a raised hand by Fatima and Ariba, so please go ahead and ask your question, Fatima. Or Ariba.
Relating to the PowerPoint, the last slide of the summaries of the wives, the order of the wives.
Right.
Like at the end, it said RTA. What does that mean?
Oh, RTA is a symbol which says Radiyallahu Ta'ala Anha, and I think I forgot to put it in front of Sada. So it's just the way that we, it's like a prayer for them. So just as we say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam with the name of the Prophet, so for the Sahaba or the wives of the Prophet, we say Radiyallahu Ta'ala Anha, which means may God be pleased with them. Yes, Amira?
Sir, why was the rule revoked for the adopted son?
You see, first of all, the adopted son is not your real son. So you actually you are in the Arab society, the status of a real son and an adopted son was exactly equal. Now, in the law of God, you just cannot marry your daughter-in-law. I mean, neither a daughter-in-law can marry the father-in-law, and vice versa. This is for real sons, the wives of your real sons. So I cannot marry my daughter-in-law cannot marry me. But in the case of an adopted son, the law of God is not the same because of the fact that the adopted son is not your real son. I mean, he's not produced by you, you have just adopted him from the society, and therefore there is no blood relationship between the father and that adopted son. So remember, relationships are prohibited on the basis of your bloodline, of your blood relationships. So because of the fact that a father does not have any blood relationship with his adopted child, so therefore if there is any situation in which an adopted child has a wife, and out of any circumstances that wife has to get married to the father-in-law, so to speak, then that is allowed. And as I said, because of the fact that there is no blood relationship between the two. However, in the case of a real son, of course, that blood relationship would exist, because then he would be marrying someone who belongs to his own fraternity, or the wife of someone who belongs to his own fraternity.
Ahsan, go ahead and ask a question.
Possible for somebody to adopt a child if they're not married to somebody?
Or, I mean, you are adopting a child, and you're not, I mean, someone is not married, he's just a father or a mother, he's just a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, and he's trying to adopt someone?
Yes.
Well, that should not be called adoption, that should be called bringing someone into your own care. Adoption only takes place, I mean, it's a technical term which means that you are bringing home someone who you would like to care as a parent. So if you're not a parent yourself, you're just someone who is like a caretaker, like someone who's caring for someone. I would say that a better word for that would be that you become the caretaker of an orphan, and of course that would be a very noble gesture. But technically, this cannot be called the adoption that we know of, because adoption is generally something in which you, as a parent, as two parents, a father and a mother, or a husband and a wife, they adopt someone. So if someone still wants to support an orphan, I would say that is still something which is possible and something something very noble. But perhaps a better word for that would be caretaking. Okay, let me ask you guys a question, and let's see how much you have understood. So can I ask you that why did the Prophet marry Zainab bint Khuzaimah? So remember, just recall the sequence. We discussed that the Prophet married wives, I mean, he married widows so that he could accommodate them, especially their children who were orphans. And there was a series of battles that took place in the times of the early Medinan period, and so therefore he married some women to accommodate their orphans, and the best way would have been to marry the mothers of the orphans. And the Qur'an actually appealed to the Muslim community that they should marry the mothers of these orphans. If I go back here, I can tell you that Zainab bint Khuzaimah was married, the Prophet married her in order to, she had become a widow, and in order to support her, especially the children that she had, the Prophet married her. Okay, just let me I would like to go through this last slide with you, and maybe you can take notes in front of this slide so that you are able to just put them in order and relate to them with the Quranic verses. So Khadija, as I said, was married out of natural circumstances for 25 years. The Prophet was in his marriage, and she died out of natural circumstances. And then what happened was that Khawla had come up to the Prophet and had suggested to him that he should marry once again because he has young children. And the Prophet said, well, if you do that, then do you have someone in mind? And she said, yes, she has someone in mind, in fact, two of them. And the Prophet said, okay, you can go and ask them. So she first went to Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr is the father of Aisha. So that lady then went to Sada, who was herself a divorcee or a widow, I'm not sure about that, but she was someone who was an elderly lady, and she consented, also consented her father consented on her behalf, and Sada also consented. The Prophet thought that it was inappropriate. He could turn both of them down, so both of them got married to the Prophet. But Aisha came home 2 years or 3 years later after the nikah in Medina, and Sada came home to the house of the Prophet in Mecca. So this is how the first three marriages took place. And then came those string of marriages which were conducted as a result of women becoming widows and children becoming orphans. And they are Zainab bint Khuzaimah, Hafsa, and Salama. So 4, 5, and 6. These were all widows, and the Prophet married them because of the fact that the Qur'an told Muslims that they should marry widows in order to accommodate their orphans. And then the seventh marriage you can see took place with Zainab bint Jahash. This marriage took place because the age-old custom of marriage with the wife and adopted son needed to be rectified, and therefore Zainab, as I just described, was married as a result, and she was first married off to Zayd ibn Harisa. Zayd ibn Harisa was actually the liberated slave of the Prophet, and he was the adopted son also of the Prophet. So when the marriage between Zayd ibn Harisa and Zainab could not work, and Zayd actually divorced Zainab bint Jahash, so the Prophet was left. He thought that the only option left with him would be to marry Zainab himself. And at the same time, the Almighty also wanted to marry Zainab bint Jahash, because the age-old custom of marriage with one's daughter, the son of the daughter of an adopted son was disallowed, so that had to be rectified. So this is how Zainab bint Jahash got married. And then the Prophet was told that women who had migrated with him from Makkah to Medina and also undergone hardships, he could marry them in order to console them. And as a result, the Prophet married Habiba, who's mentioned at number 8, and she was also the sister of Abu Sufyan, who later accepted faith, but who was a very, very strong and staunch enemy of the Prophet earlier on. And the Quran also said that women who became prisoners of war in military campaigns, and they belonged to noble families, they could also the Prophet would also marry them. So Javed and Safiya, they were caught in 2 military campaigns, 2 separate military campaigns, but unfortunately, once they were set free, they did not want to go back. Both of them actually accepted Islam also, and they did not want to go back to their own tribes. So when the Prophet suggested to them, they consented, and both of them married the Prophet. So this was 9 and 10. And 11 was another category, which is Maimuna. And Maimuna radiyallahu anha got married to the Prophet because the Quran had told the Prophet that if in case there are women who just like themselves to be associated with him, and he also could have this, the time and the consent, then he could do so. So as a result, he married Maimuna. So in all, we have him marrying these 11 wives. But as I said, all of these 11 wives, the way these marriages took place, they took place as a result of certain responsibilities that were imposed on the Prophet. And out of these 11, 2 had already died. One of them was Aisha, and the other one, one of them was Khadija, and the other one was Zainab bint Khuzaimah. So the 1 and 4 mentioned they died in the in the life of the Prophet. And so in the Prophet's own lifetime, he had those 9 wives. So amongst those 9 wives, the Prophet was told that he was not allowed to divorce them, because once they had become wives of the Prophet, they were virtually the mothers of the Muslims, because the Prophet was like the father to the Muslims. So his wives were like the mothers of the Muslims, and the Prophet could not have divorced her or changed them. And at the same time, the restriction of doing justice between the wives was lifted, because all these marriages were conducted for a particular reason, owing to prophethood and messengerhood. But in spite of the fact that this restriction was lifted, we find history telling us that even in the case of these 9 wives, the Prophet meted out justice with them. Any further questions? Should we end the session now? Because I know that there are 2 questions still remaining. But maybe if this session has been very heavy, we can discuss them some other time. One of them, of course, is the fact that how do we know, or why is it that people still say that Aisha was just a 6 or 7 year old child when she got married? As I said, this is an historical fallacy. This is not correct. And the as far as the other aspect is concerned, that why was Maria the Copt a slave lady of the Prophet, that of course is something, again, a question that you might have in your minds, but that is perhaps something that we can discuss whilst we are discussing slavery separately in a separate session.
I don't see any raise hands.
So, how many of you know the fact that Aisha was 7 years old or 9 years old when she got married? Have you ever heard of this? Any one of you?
Yeah.
Okay. And did this question come to your mind, whether this is true or not, or did it bother you?
So they bother me, and whenever they said it, I didn't really believe it. That it's not possible.
Absolutely correct. And let me just explain this in the form of a very short note, so that you can keep this in your mind. So you see, what happened is that Aisha has a sister called Asma. They are two sisters. Now, history tells us that Asma is 10 years older to Aisha, and Asma died in 72 Hijrah, and she was 100 years old. So Aisha was 10 years younger to her. This would mean that if Asma was 100 years old in 72 or 73 Hijri, at the time of migration, her age would be how much? 27. Asma, have it again. Asma is 10 years older to Aisha. Asma has actually died in 73 Hijrah at the age of 100. So at the time of migration, she must have been 27. And because Aisha was 10 years younger to her, Aisha would be 17 at the time of migration. And because of the fact, we also know that she came to the house of the Prophet 2 years after migration, which was in Medina. So we can add 2 to 17, that makes 19. So she was in fact 19 years old at the time of this marriage, and it is an absolute fallacy to see that she was 7 or 8 years old. And this has arisen because of the fact there are certain narratives in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, one of the books of Hadith, which say that she was 7 or 9 years old. They are, of course, misreported, I would say, and they have been wrongly reported because, as I said, history supports this very clearly, that she was actually 17 at the time of migration, and then after migration, she was brought home to the Prophet's house 2 years later, which makes her 19. So, absolutely right with your conclusion, although your conclusion was based on common sense, and of course, this is also corroborated by historical facts. So, okay, thank you very much. I think we should be ending this session now. It was a slightly heavy session. If you're able to go through it whenever you have the time, or even read about it. I've written about this issue as well at some places, and this might help you in gauging the fact that these marriages of the Prophet were never conducted because of any lust or any desire, as has been generally alleged by a lot of our critics, but all of them were conducted for certain causes and for certain reasons. And as far as the life of the Prophet is concerned, till the age of well over 50, he had just one wife, and later on it were these contingent circumstances which arose, and which as a result entailed that he marry. And of course, as I said, these marriages were conducted at the behest of the Almighty Himself, and the Almighty wanted to rectify certain customs. The Almighty made this appeal that widows should be accommodated. The Almighty told the Prophet that he should console women who had migrated with him. He should console women who were caught in a military campaign. He should console women who would like to dedicate themselves to the Prophet. So you see, all these marriages had a certain background and mostly were conducted at the behest of God Almighty Himself. So thank you very much for hearing out this session, and inshallah we'll be back next week with a different topic. Until then, it's Khuda Hafiz from your teacher.